Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have Dr. Martin Kolb presenting on IPF clinical trial management. Dr. Kolb is the Moran Campbell Chair and Professor in Respirology Medicine and Director of the Division of Respirology at McMaster University. His major research interests is fibrotic lung disease, with a particular interest in the role of growth factors and matrix abnormalities in disease progression. He leads activities in biomarker development for lung fibrosis and is a principal investigator and steering committee member in numerous ILD clinical trials. Dr. Kolb has authored over 130 peer-reviewed publications on different basic science and clinical topics. He is the chief editor of the European Respirology Journal for 2018 to 2023. Dr. Kolb is also a member of the Canadian Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Medical Advisory Board, and he was recently named chair of the Jack Aldi Bullringer Chair in Interstitial Lung Disease. So Dr. Martin Kolb, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sharon, and it's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to help raise awareness for pulmonary fibrosis. Some of you may have heard me before, and I think I believe I'm a strong fighter for the cause here and for pulmonary fibrosis, and try to do this on different fronts in the basic science lab and in collaboration with industry to develop new medicines. And of course, I have a big clinical practice as well, where I look after patients, and some of you might be listening in right now. So I am talking today about drug treatments for IPF, but I don't want this to be dry and just about drugs, because there's so much more, obviously. Drugs are just one small but important element to the management of patients. I just want to set this in the larger context of what we do, how we manage patients, and of course, I have mostly scientific slides here, but I am trying to make them understandable for everyone. And I'm around for questions, so don't be shy to ask questions, either by the chat function, the Q&A, or connecting with Sharon. So I just want to share a patient story here, and I'm sure that you have had similar stories that you heard of, or you may have feel some of the same thing. Gentleman that I saw about 3 years ago, man who had shortness of breath on strenuous exertion, had a bit cough, no other symptoms really. And then he had these crackly sounds on the chest that we hear, normal blood pressure, heart rate. So he was otherwise pretty healthy, really just a bit reflux, acid reflux. And his breathing test showed that the lungs were a bit smaller than they should be. And I always show these pictures to my patients who know me. And I tell them what is fibrosis here. And you will probably have seen CT scans. And we look at normal lung tissue looking like this here, which is kind of these darkish gray. And you see these lines that branch like branches of a tree. Those are blood vessels, air tubes. And you see how these things get smaller and smaller when you come to the outside. Now, here are some spots where this pattern is disturbed. So you see much more thickened stuff here at the outside. This is what we call reticulation. And this is where we have some scar tissue. Now, this gentleman was offered to get a biopsy done, but he didn't feel much. He wasn't too fond of someone taking a piece of his lungs, which is fair enough. And we kept observing him, but he got worse over 2 years. Again, the patients of your caregivers may have experienced similar things from your own experience. And he was worse with his insertion level. So, and the dry cough was pretty much unchanged. And now what he has in those 2 years, the breathing volume in his lungs dropped by about 440 milliliters. So that's about a pint of air if you look in the volumes. And his CT scan now shows that these thick lines at the outside of the lungs are more extensive. And this is including some spots that we describe as honeycombing and traction bronchiectasis. So this is a relatively typical picture for someone with IPF. I always and that room is getting full of spider webs in the corners of that room, and these spider webs will never go away. The more dense these spider webs will get, and the more they will invade into this room, the smaller will be the space where you can walk in. And this is literally what you would have as breathing volume. And this is what we measure with this magic vital capacity, which is basically when we ask a patient to take a deep breath as much as they can and then breathe it all out as quickly as they can. And that amount of volume, that's the vital capacity. And obviously, if you have more spider webs around this room's corner, the walkable room space will get smaller. And in the lungs, the volume gets slower and the lungs get more stiff and the patient feels breathlessness. Now, this gentleman that was treated with antifibrotics after getting information about it, he took nintedanib. Because of COVID, we couldn't really do much in terms of repeat breathing tests. And then suddenly it got worse without much warning. It took just a week or two that he felt really bad. He was breathless at rest and he had no fever. COVID testing was negative. And what you can see here now in these CT scans is that the scarring is still here. And now you see these spots that have a hazy texture, right? So it's not as dark gray as here. It's not as bright white as these thick lines. It's kind of this haziness. And this is what we call ground glass opacity. So this poor gentleman had developed a flare and acute exacerbation. And about 2 weeks later, you see how this involved the whole lungs of this man. And unfortunately, he passed away. So this is one of the things that you fear as a patient that you don't like. Of course, when the lungs shrink progressively, your volumes that you can breathe go down. And then you have these events that are called exacerbations, which we always tell you to let us know as soon as you feel bad, right? So this is really what we are tackling, and this is what we're tackling with medicines and drugs as well. Now, you may know some of these folks here. We're all heavily involved in the foundation work. So this is our foundation founder, Robert Davidson. And this is Stephen Binch, and this is Barbara Barr. Sadly, all three have now moved on because of either their disease or post-lung transplantation. But you know, they always liked me to put their pictures up. This was actually a fun fundraising event a couple of years ago where we played basketball with Nick Stauskas from the NBA. And there was really a great turnout with a couple of hundred people there. I think Sharon was there. There was really great fundraising event. Sadly, we can't do that right now with COVID, but happy to do it again. So anyway, so I just want to put a few of the questions that you may have into these phases. And obviously, if you read about it, and I do this every time I get a new patient, you read this 50-50 chance of dying within 3 to 4 years. Yeah, so this is obviously not a very nice piece of information. And so you want to make sure that the doctors show that you have this disease so that you can plan accordingly. Then this is what we're talking about mostly today. Is there anything there to make me live longer? So what about therapies? And Robert, in the end, he said, I had a relatively good run. He feels it got worse. And then at that point, it's really much more about preserving quality of life. Yeah, so we'll address those three things very briefly. Yep. How do we make a diagnosis and then do we treat it? And I really will not focus today much on these symptom approaches, but happy to address questions as well, right? So you know that fibrosis, IPF, and other types of fibrosis makes a long string. So they get smaller and they get stiffer. You feel that by getting breathless. And we can measure that by measuring the amount of air that you can breathe in and out. And we have heard about these really bad episodes of acute exacerbations. We know this is not the most common disease, but it is also not that uncommon. And a rare disease, as defined by governments, would be something that's affecting less than 50 per 100,000, which is true for IPF in the whole population, but most of the patients involved are a bit more in the older age range. So under 50 would be quite unusual. And most patients are really 60, 65 and higher. And in that, it affects about 200 per 100,000. So that's not rare at all. And a family doctor would, through his lifetime, have certainly a number of patients affected by this disease. And somebody
wants to know, why do you only refer to IPF? Because this patient has PF.
Yeah, I think the answer is right now here.
Oh, okay.
so the IPF is sort of the prototype of these disorders, but you're totally correct, and this pie chart breaks it down. So there are many different types of pulmonary fibrosis. We are often referring to IPF primarily because this is the disease where we know most about, and particularly when it's about drug treatments. That's the disease that is studied by far the best. Yeah, but there are a lot of the other types of pulmonary fibrosis. We do somewhat an extrapolation, which is right in many ways, but it's not a one-to-one extrapolation. But when we talk about fibrosis, it's really quite similar what you see in IPF lungs and in the other types of pulmonary fibrosis. But you're totally correct that about in a clinic like mine, or Dr. Fell's or Dr. Shapiro's and Raya's, and in these specialty clinics, IPF is about a quarter of what we do. Yeah, so that means 3/4 of patients have other diseases. They have some differences in approach, but once fibrosis drives the problem, they are quite similar in the end. Yeah, and in fact, this is just to make you really confused now, not on purpose, but that's what it is. Yeah, so there are really about 200 types of diseases in this group that we call interstitial lung disease, as opposed to airway disease or pulmonary vascular disease. And we often put a lot of effort in getting the proper name to your disorder so that we manage it rightly. And we measure how much air can you take in with a deep breath. So this is really a measure of the volume of the lungs. Yeah, just remember that room with a spider web, so without. And then they measure something that a lot of patients don't like because it takes some time and needs some breath holds. It's a measurement of how well does a gas, oxygen in real life or carbon monoxide in our labs, how well does that travel from the airspace into the blood space? So those are the two tests that we do very commonly in order to determine if someone gets worse, if someone is stable, or if a drug therapy is effective or not. And we looked at these pictures. So I always spend a lot of time with my patients, look at these pictures, and you see again these areas of spiderweb formations or reticulation with these honeycomb-like areas. Yeah. So, and a lot of healthy lung tissue is also present. So this is why there's still a good amount of activity left. And of course, Steve had this question at the very beginning. He actually lived for longer than his 3 to 4 years, but he had the same question at the beginning. And on average, these numbers are still true. These numbers are all from a time prior to the first approval of drugs for lung fibrosis. We're currently updating this study, but I also tell my patients this applies to a whole group of patients. It's helpful for someone like me or someone like Sharon, and the average time that someone lives with this disease is in fact in that low range, but it is never possible to extrapolate that to a person, because one person could easily live 10, 15 years and longer with it, and some other individuals have a very rapid decline and live much shorter. Yeah, and they come much later into a clinical practice. Yeah, so don't overread these numbers, and because they don't mean anything for an individual that reads it. Yeah, but of course that brings IPF really quite similar to what we know about cancer. And I don't want to make you afraid of this, but of course this is a slide that we often use when we speak to politicians or policymakers who don't know much about a disease like pulmonary fibrosis. And they should really know that this is not any different than cancer in the survival. So every politician would know about colon cancer and breast cancer, kidney cancer, but they would always be super surprised when I say, well, this disease is worse than cancer. I mean, there are some cancers, of course, that are even worse than IPF, but that's a slide that we use a lot to provide awareness. So basically says, yes, we need drugs, yes, we need therapies, yes, we need to do clinical trials. This is what I'm going to focus on now for a little while. So what about therapies? And so for the folks in the audience who are interested in a clinical trial and are interested in how do we actually find out how a drug works or whether a drug works or not, this can only be done reliably in what we call a randomized clinical trial, which means you have a group of participants. So we approach them typically, we ask, are you interested in doing a clinical trial? So I am usually quite casual. I ask my patients if they want to be a guinea pig, and my patients usually like it. Of course, those are high-level guinea pigs, and there's much more safety checks in our clinical trial world. But essentially, a group of volunteers, participants with a disease, is assigned to an intervention group. That's the patients who would get the no drug, and a control group that would be a patients who get either no drug or no drug, but usually placebo. And then in the end, you compare the outcomes. So ideally, in that intervention group with a no drug, you will have more smiley faces here than in the placebo group, which means that this intervention is better than the placebo. And that would be an outcome where a regulator, a government says, yes, you have proven that this works, and we approve this drug or in this intervention for therapy. Now, randomization is not done locally. So we usually, it's just a computer program that randomly assigns a patient to one group or the other. So no one really has any influence about this. And patients often ask that. Yeah, obviously, a patient in a trial would much more prefer to be on the drug arm than in the placebo arm. But this is all random and no one knows. Yeah, so a computer will tell a study site which group a patient is assigned to. And then the study site will not know about it because it's double blind, right? So basically, the patient doesn't know what they get, and the doctor and the study coordinator also don't know what they get. So this is what's called a double-blind randomized clinical trial. So no one knows who gets what. And that's very important because obviously a patient who is volunteering for a clinical trial or a doctor who's conducting a clinical trial wants this new drug to work. And if you are starting with that expectation and you know you have the new drug as opposed to having a placebo, you will automatically feel better, right? Because you know you're doing something. And that is why these trials are always blinded. Now, it's not that blind, so it's not that no one checks. And I want the listeners to be sure that there are a lot of safety checkpoints all the time, in real time, literally. So when we do a clinical trial, we get constantly notification about side effects that were observed and side effects in the whole trial, so related to the drug or not. But there is a committee that is called the Data Safety Monitoring Committee. And those are a group of experts who see the information in an unblinded way. So they know exactly who gets which drug. And they make sure that this intervention is safe for the patients. Once an intervention is unsafe, then this Data Safety Monitoring Committee has the power to recommend termination of this trial if they think this is too dangerous intervention. Yeah, so there are a lot of checkpoints that are done behind the scenes, because the most important thing about all these clinical trials is that the patients and volunteers in these trials have to be very safe. Okay, so these slides just give you a little bit of hint of how complex it is. And this complexity and the duration that we need in order to test these new drugs is the reason why new drugs are always pretty expensive, because it costs a lot of money to do all this and to do all these investigations in a proper and safe way. So all these trials have caused us to find a so-called standard of care for IPF. This is another one of my patients, Gerard. He had IPF. And we know that immunosuppressive drugs such as prednisone or cyclophosphamide, which were used historically for IPF, don't have a place in this disease. Antifibrotic drugs do, and anti-acid medications, or like reflux medication, do as well. This applies to IPF. In other disorders that could cause pulmonary fibrosis, such as the person who asked the question to Sharon, steroids might well be useful at the beginning of the disease. Once the disease is more advanced, they may become less useful. Yeah, but there are distinctions between the types of pulmonary fibrosis that an individual has. So for IPF, it's a no to prednisone, at least higher doses. For other diseases, if you have hypersensitivity pneumonitis or rheumatoid arthritis or another autoimmune disease, then this is quite different. But the drug development that is currently pursued is really much more focused on the antifibrotics in all these conditions, not so much on the anti-inflammatories. And here you see why we talk about IPF so much, because the last 20, 25 years really were characterized by studying IPF. And these circles just reflect how sizable a clinical trial is. So these big circles are about 800 patients, and smallest circles are between 150 and 250, 300 patients. You see how many studies were done and how many patients were really studied over the last 25 years in this field. And this is how we learned about this disease so much. One thing we learned is that we should find it, if we can, early, and we should intervene early, because you will not regain lost lung function, right? So once your lungs are shrinking, you don't get them bigger again. So the best you can do with current medicines is just stop it from getting worse at the point when you begin. So this is very important to know. And we also know that a patient typically loses about 200 to 250 milliliter in breathing volume per year. You remember that patient story I had shared at the beginning. That gentleman lost about 500, so about a pint in 2 years. So this is exactly what the disease does. If you get older and you don't have the disease, you lose much less. You just lose about a shot glass worth of volume per year. Yeah, so a shot glass versus a half a pint, that's quite a difference if you do this year by year. So this is really where our drug development aims at. Yeah, so this is the primary outcome for all these clinical trials. And these trials that I showed you have led to this treatment recommendation, which is an international grouping, American Thoracic Society, European, Japanese, and this Latin American. So they all agreed that you should consider treatment with nintedanib, pirfenidone, and anti-reflux medication in a good number of patients. Some of these drugs were tested and were found to be either dangerous or not useful. And obviously, oxygen and lung transplantation is something that, so lung transplantation for a selected few, and oxygen is common sense that this helps someone. And so reflux medication was not tested in a randomized clinical trial, but from big centers like this one in San Francisco or others, we have learned that patients who are on reflux medication have less often these acute flares, these acute exacerbations, and may live longer. So that's why a lot of patients would be on anti-reflux medication. You may ask, why didn't this get tested the same way as the other drugs? Simple answer, because they're way too cheap, these drugs. So a month supply of a pantoprazole or something, that's just $20, $30. And of course, one of these trials that I'm going to show you will cost about 100 million, one of them. Yeah, so if you can't really make any money as a company, you would likely not invest that much into it. So only governments could finance these studies. Yeah, that's why this was not really tested. And those are the slopes of curves that we are looking at in this field. So those are basically the volume that you lose in 1 year here, so 52 weeks. When you are on a drug, pirfenidone or nintedanib, that's the upper curves, or when you are in the placebo arm. And you see that about 200, 300 milliliter is what you lose per year when you are in a placebo arm, so you don't get a drug. If you get pirfenidone or nintedanib, you lose about half of it. And you still lose something, but it's not as quick. And obviously, there's only so much you can lose until the lungs stop functioning. Then we would, of course, assume that you live longer when you take these medicines. And that's why we really recommend taking them as long as you tolerate them. Pirfenidone is a small molecule, a small chemical molecule that is easily packaged into a pill. And what this drug does, it is interferes with cells called fibroblasts. These fibroblasts are the cells that make scar tissue in the body. So if you cut yourself on the finger and the hand somewhere, or get a cut on your forehead, in the end, you need your fibroblasts just to tie that up, yeah, just to make a homemade suture, yeah, which can sometimes look ugly, or it can look in a way that you almost don't see it, right? So normally, these fibroblasts do the job, and then they disappear once the job is done. So once the wound is closed. In individuals who get fibrosis, and that is true for IPF and for other types of pulmonary fibrosis, this process of scar formation just does not stop. So these fibroblasts keep doing what they are taught to do, but they don't stop. That's what they also usually taught to do, but in the disease, they don't do it. And this is where drugs like pirfenidone, so they make them stop doing it. And the pirfenidone studies clearly have shown that when you reduce this loss of lung shrinking, you improve mortality. Yeah, so you live longer if someone stops your lung function to shrink. So this is very important, because regulators like Health Canada or the FDA, they want, of course, before they approve a new drug, they want to know, so do you just change a number, which is one thing that you can do with statistics, but does that mean anything to a patient? Because they will always tell us, yes, your drug intervention doesn't make a patient feel much better. Yeah, in fact, some feel worse because they have side effects. So the regulators will ask us, does that patient at least live longer? And this is what is shown in this graph here. So yes, we know now if we affect that one number, we affect mortality on average. And what governments also want to know is, with your intervention, do you do something to hospitalizations? So does a patient who is on a drug like Epiphenidone or nintedanib need hospitalization less frequently as a patient who is not on these drugs, which you see here? So hospitalizations related to breathing trouble in this trial was less, which for a government means, yes, if I can keep my patients outside of the hospital, for one, it's quality of life because no one wants to be in the hospital. So patients will feel better on average. And knowing how costly it is to be in a hospital, with probably a cost of about $1,000 per day, if not more, hospitals drive costs, and the government will say, well, if you keep my people outside of the hospital with an expensive drug, we save money on that one front, so it's justified to pay it at the other side. Yeah, so this is something that's very important for a government and also very important for a patient's perspective. Now, nintedanib is a different drug. It's also a pill. And you see again these word fibroblasts. So this drug literally does also attack these fibroblasts and the way how they make scar tissue in a different way from a biology perspective. So I don't want to talk about that in detail. So there's very different to pirfenidone, but fundamentally it also works on that scar formation. And you see again, this is the slope. That's the loss of lung function over time. And in these big trials, sometimes we see an effect between the drug and the placebo arm after 3 months already. That doesn't mean that a patient would feel it, because these are just averages of 400 or 500 patients. So you have a lot of data points in these. For a single patient, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah, so you would never be giving up on a drug before a year is over, or 2 even, unless you don't tolerate it. Yeah, because an individual will not feel what you see in these graphs. And again, sometimes we need to tell regulators and politicians that these numbers are statistics. They are not people. Yeah, I mean, yes, they are made out of individual people, but you can't extrapolate what you see in these graphs to a single person. Yeah, so with other words, a government could not shut us down after 3 months when we don't show that something is not working, because it's just impossible. Yeah, and we also have learned from these trials, and that's very important, that it doesn't matter how sick you are. So if you have, this is the vital capacity, so this is how much air you can breathe. It's less than 90% of what you should. This is more than 90%. So these folks are probably feeling nothing of their disease. We just see it on an image. These ones would be patients who feel something, but you see that even if you don't feel anything, you lose about 200 milliliter per year. And that's the gentleman I showed you before. He didn't feel much, but he lost that amount. And yeah, that's really true across the border. If you intervene with these medicines, you reduce that loss of lung function. So even if you don't feel anything, this drug makes you having lungs that shrink less quickly. And obviously, it will take much more time until you feel something. Yeah, so that's an effect that is important, that I always tell my patients about. And then a lot of patients and even doctors would be worried that these drugs may lose efficacy after a given time. Yeah, so it may just like wane and wax. So they stop working after a year or 2 or 3. Yeah, so some patients will say, well, I want to wait until I really need it. Right now, I don't feel anything, because they may not work at a later time point. And that's, by all we know, not true. So we have done trials up to 4 years now. And it seems as if this slope is the same all the time, right? So you see over these, I mean, this is 3 years here. You lose about 300. A patient without drug would be at the bottom of the slide here in that time period. They would have lost about 600 in this time period, which obviously is a good success of these medicines as long as you tolerate them. Then some patients wonder if the presence of emphysema, because this is a common disease in smokers, a lot of patients with different types of fibrosis have smoked as well. That would affect how these drugs work. Bottom line, it does not. So patients with emphysema or no emphysema, the drug treatment, the dark blue versus the placebo, is always doing better. So that is something that is not a factor. You're very severe. We sometimes add drugs. So this is where we do new trials now. So we use one drug plus a second drug. So this drug may be known to some people as a drug that is used to treat erectile dysfunction. That's called Viagra. It's the same thing, but it's also used to treat pulmonary hypertension, which means high blood pressure in the lungs. And that's a problem that often comes in patients with IPF or other types of pulmonary fibrosis when they get more severe. Right? So when they get more sick, they get this pulmonary hypertension. So we asked the question, does the combination of a fibrosis and a pulmonary vessel drug help patients how they do? And it actually is a combination that is well tolerated by the patients. And it's a combination here that makes survival or loss of lung function less likely. So the importance of this trial was really that this was a trial that looked at very sick patients. So they were all on oxygen pretty much, and they were all very severely impaired. And we treated them with 2 drugs in this experimental setting. We rarely can prescribe those 2 drugs at the same time because sildenafil is not approved for IPF. It's only approved if you have pulmonary hypertension alone or if you have scleroderma and pulmonary hypertension. But it's an important study because it showed us that we can safely offer these trials to patients who have more severe disease. And obviously, if you're more sick, you are much more inclined to do something about your disease, even if it may not work necessarily, but you want to take some action, not just like fall into your fate, right? So the safety, as I said before, is extremely important for all these trials. And we know that Epiphenidone and Nintedanib are very, very safe drugs. So you hardly ever see anything dangerous in terms of side effects, which is quite different to drugs like prednisone or cyclophosphamide. But the ones who took it or taking it, they know for sure that you can have diarrhea, and that can be quite annoying and quite difficult, sometimes even causing dehydration, which then tells us you can't use this drug. Or Epiphenidone often causes nausea, fatigue, and decreased appetite, or it can cause these nasty skin rashes. But those are all things that are often manageable in real life. But what it also shows us, together with what I showed you before, for one, despite being on these drugs, you still decline more than you should. So it doesn't stop, it just slows it down. And this side effect information shows that there's room for doing better, right? So you want, even if a drug would not be any better than Nintedanib and Epiphenidone in how they work and what they do, if they would be better tolerated, that would be great, right? Because of course you don't like to take a drug that makes you feel bad, even if you makes you feel longer, right?
Dr. Kolb, there's 2 questions. One of them is a patient who is an IPF patient was wondering if they should take Panazole for their GERD.
That is you should ask your doctor, of course, right? But my patients who, when they have reflux symptoms, so when they feel heartburn or something, or kind of a lot of burping, or when they have a lot of cough, dry cough, I would typically treat them with a drug like pantoprazole.
Okay.
But not everyone would do it. But I mean, some doctors with who treat pulmonary fibrosis are very liberal, and they give them to pretty much all the patients. But if you have symptoms, then I would give it, yes.
Okay. And the second question, Dr. Kolb, is that you're talking about the drug nintedanib, and apparently right now it's been approved for all pulmonary fibrosis patients. But why is it that only the folks that are IPF can get coverage for it and the rest can't?
Yeah, so that's one of the things where we are all working very hard on, including Sharon and the CPFF. So it's I mean, it's true. So nintedanib was tested for IPF at first, and then because of the need of looking at the other types of pulmonary fibrosis, it was also tested for these other types. And it was shown in one of these trials, as I described them, that it works for these people as well. Other drugs may have their place in other diseases at the beginning, but once they are behaving like IPF, like one of the patients I showed you, these drugs work. Now, Health Canada has approved nintedanib for this indication about 1.5 years ago. And that's just the first step. So basically, Health Canada says, yes, it's safe to use these drugs. Yes, it works. And then it goes to the provinces. And the provinces would then negotiate with the companies if they are covered, if there's a need, and how much do they pay. And that typically takes about 1 year, give or take, after approval. So we had now 1 year full of COVID, and I'm sure that the people in the Ministry of Health were working very hard to handle the pandemic, and it may have caused that delay, but we literally wait for these drugs to get approval any day now, but I don't know exactly where they are, but it's longer than usual. But of course we had, of course, a health crisis that was unprecedented, and people who usually work in this field have had other stuff to do, right? Private insurers partly pay it already. And of course, if someone is wealthy enough to afford it, we could prescribe it because we are allowed to prescribe it. Yeah, but I truly hope basically every week that there is some good news from the provincial governments.
Okay, thank you. Another question is actually this person, if they wanted to, they can just go back to our website and look at the generic antifibrotics, because they want to know if the generic Epiphenidone is as good as the original Esprit.
So I would say likely, but I mean, that's what generics do, right? So a generic is, a generic manufacturer has to show that their drug does the same thing in a cell culture dish, that the drug does the same thing in terms of how it's taken up from the intestines when you swallow it as a pill, or if it's an injection, how it's distributed in the body. And they have to show that it's safe and doesn't cause any damage to the liver or kidney or bone marrow. And they have done all this. What a generic manufacturer does not have to do is they don't have to do these clinical trials that I talked about, and I'm going into the new clinical trials in a minute. And this is why they are much cheaper, right? So because the drug development, the cost for drug development is really ramping up once you are at that stage where you need to test the drug in a patient, because you need to put all these safety measures in place, and you have to do all these tests, and you have to do them regularly. So this is immensely costly. So all these trials that I showed you, say this inspiration, this impulses trial, or the in-stage trial, or the ascent trial, each of these trials easily cost about $100 million just to do it. Yeah, so they're hugely costly, these trials. And the generic manufacturer, they don't have the cost. So they just do the inexpensive tests. And yes, they have usually good quality products, which are likely working as good as the brand name. But they save money at other fronts. And if it were just about generic manufacturers, we would not have a new drug at all, because they piggyback basically on what others have done and have invested in. Yeah, but if you take that generic as Epiphenidone from, I think only Sandoz Epiphenidone is on the market now, I would just trust that this works as well as Esbriet did.
Okay. Another patient wanted to ask you, if you're taking one of these drugs, and the side effects that you have clearly demonstrated, for example, this person's taken Nitividine. They took it in the morning and took it at night, but they were having some severe, side effects to it. And they were wondering, because they went back down just 1 dose a day. Do you think that they should try to go back up to 2 doses a day?
So I mean, very difficult to give really customized advice here. In principle, 1 dose a day would not give you enough drug exposure. So you would, if it gets below 100 milligram twice a day, you would likely not have enough drug exposure. So that's all we know, that you need 100 or 150 to get enough tissue levels to be working. So if you can just tolerate 1 pill a day or every other day, I think you're not really doing anything good to you. You're just struggling with side effects for no good reason. Yeah, but I think this would be a question that you should address directly, because it needs other pieces of information that I don't have.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kolb, because they said that they are on 150, but I think you're right that they should probably consult with their own respirologist specialist.
Yeah, so if you are on 150, 1 a day, I would think that you should be going to 100 twice a day rather than 151 a day.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I hope I didn't torture you too much with this slide hanging in there for too long, because obviously this is how sometimes the side effects feel. Yeah, and this is how I often describe it to my patients, and then a patient is really encouraged to pick the drug of their choice or pick the side effect of their choice, because some people are having an easier time to deal with diarrhea, and others have an easier time to deal with nausea. And you can address it through lifestyle changes and of course gravel and Imodium and stuff like that. Yeah, but it's often a patient preference. Now, we clearly have learned that patients want these drugs. Doctors are sometimes a bit hesitant. I use this slide a lot to convince doctors that, well, if it doesn't matter what you want, I have shown you that they work in patients with mild disease. And if you survey patients with this disease, they said, yes, I want to try these drugs. Yeah, at least the majority wants to try these drugs. It's not at all that I'm a drug pusher. I will never agree to that statement, but I would want a patient to get access to drugs that are approved, that we know work, and they should know about the side effects and the risks of taking a drug, and then a decision about starting treatment or not is, I think, always made together. I mean, the doctor and the patient together would be the best position to make a decision about starting a drug or not. Now, this is now looking really complicated, and I promise you it is complicated, because this is literally showing you how scar formation works on the microscopic levels. Yeah, so you have a number of different cells here, air tube cells, bronchial cells. Those are alveolar cells to the lining in the air sacs. They are fibroblasts. We heard about those guys. We have blood vessels in the lungs. We have this scar tissue. So this is collagen fibers. So a lot of complexity in this disorder, and all these different acronyms here depict a new drug that targets one of these players. So pulmonary fibrosis, and that applies to IPF and all other types of fibrosis, have different elements here being overactive. So all these elements in isolation are normal because you need wound healing, you need scar tissue to survive. But normally these fibroblasts, it's called apoptosis. Once the job is done, they undergo apoptosis. In short, they kill themselves once they're not needed anymore because job is done, I don't have anything to do, so they undergo apoptosis, commit suicide. And they don't do that in fibrosis. So, and a lot of these normal processes go wrong, and you see just these numerous compounds that are tested in clinical trials because drug developers know, just as patients and doctors, that there is still progression despite approved therapies, and the approved therapies are not working in everyone, and they're on top of it sometimes not tolerated. So there's a lot of need, and you see that drug developers have picked that up. And you just see that big list of drugs that are currently in clinical trials, so human phenotypic trials if you want, yeah, in phase 2 or 3 clinical trials. So those are the larger trials between 40 to 800 patients. Yeah, so a lot of these different compounds are currently in clinical development, and you may ask, are they available for patients in Canada? And would they be promising or not? So in the last little while, there were a lot of failures, like all the time. So for instance, it was tested if antibiotics, Septra, that's called cotrimoxazole, work in patients with IPF, and it wasn't really very convincing that they work. There's a marginal difference between them, but it didn't really work well. So this was a negative clinical trial. Then there's another one with Septra or doxycycline. That was a negative clinical trial. And there is now a number of trials that were a bit more promising. So this was a company done by a company called Galapagos. It's called an autotaxin inhibitor. This is another one of these molecules that are involved in this fibroblast activity. So this trial was very promising to a degree that they did a huge clinical trial with aiming for about 1,600 patients, so a tremendously big trial. Just to give you a flavor, my cost estimate for that trial is easily $150 million to conduct it. And that trial was stopped in the meantime because of likely a safety concern. So one of these safety checkpoints that I told you about, the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, has probably seen a signal that looked like patients might be at risk. And the faintest signal here is usually causing one of these trials to get stopped. So there's nothing really public as beyond what I've just said, so no one knows exactly what happened here, but it is to the credit of the company here. They listened to the safety check and they stopped the trial immediately, and they now analyze what was there anything wrong with this compound or with the target, or what? I mean, so really just to put safety of patients above anything else. And another trial, it's called Pentraxin. This is an infusion that was also published already. And again, I was a promising clinical trial. And this trial is now recruiting subjects as well as they recruit them in Canada. Another study, that molecule targets connective tissue growth factor. Again, this is a factor that is in the lungs that would stimulate fibroblasts to make more scar tissue. Also got these slopes. Yeah, so this is a good slope. This is the drug, this is the placebo. So that's a trial that we would call promising. So it needs a bigger trial. So this was a trial of maybe 100, 120 patients, give or take. Yeah, so yeah, exactly 101. So now we need a bigger trial with about 400 or 500 patients at least to show if it works or not. Yeah, and those are the costly ones. Yeah, so.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But someone wanted to ask you, are all these clinical trials for all these drugs, is their aim to cure people with pulmonary fibrosis, or is their aim to allow the patient to live with the disease?
Yes, I think a cure is a very ambitious word. So you can cure a pneumonia. You can probably not cure diabetes. You take drugs and you do lifestyle changes to live with it, right? You cannot cure pulmonary fibrosis, but you can make it stop and then learn how to live with it at the time when you stop it. That's why we always say you should start treatment as early as possible or as you wish, because once you have lost a certain amount of function, you can't regain it. Yeah, so stopping progression is really what we are currently aiming for. Yeah, improving things, that's probably a tune for the future, for the likely distant future. Yeah, but most people would say, well, if at least stops now, that's manageable. Right, so this is really what we aim for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and so we are aware that we need to combine drugs, right? So you could combine the drugs that are approved, Epiphenidone and Nintedanib. They're both approved. Of course, the government covers only one. But in an ideal world, you would say, well, the one drug stops your progression by 50%. The other drug stops your progression by 50%. So do the math, 50 plus 50 is 100. When I take both, it stops. That's a good assumption. You just have to show that this is the case, right? So now what you also have to show is that if you combine this one with that one, it's safe enough. So does that add toxicity or cause your liver to be damaged? Or of course, if you already have nausea and weight loss here and you get diarrhea and weight loss there, is that manageable from a side effect profile, right? So you can combine those two. It's safe enough. It's reasonably tolerable. Does it work better? We don't know, because no one did these costly studies yet that show if the combination works better. But what is done is to test these new drugs on top of old drugs, or to test new drugs in patients who did not tolerate the old drugs and see if they are better. And this is the red circle. Those are all trials that are going on in Canada right now. And two of these trials have in the meantime stopped. Yeah, the first one is the one that I just showed you from Galapagos that has been terminated. That other compound down there, which is called PVI 4050, the company has made internal decisions that they don't want to pursue this any further. So it leaves us, to my knowledge, with those 4 drugs that are currently enrolling in Canada. And I have just put some information in here. So all these trials that are new have to be registered with a website, mostly the one that is on the US NIH. So the National Clinical Trial Registry. So they have these NCT numbers. So if you type this number into a Google search, you'll find that trial. You will know exactly how this trial is, what it is. Yeah. So this is an oral compound that targets structures that are called integrins. Again, I don't want to give you too much details, but it's an oral compound. It's an earlier clinical trial. And in Canada, you have 3 sites here. There's one in Toronto, one in Windsor, and we are in Hamilton. So this is a trial that has started in Canada. Galecto, this is an inhaler, actually. It's one of the few trials that look at inhaled drugs. a much bigger trial. They look for 500 participants, and some of the sites with this trial are in Hamilton. We do one. There's one in Windsor, again, actually 2 in Windsor, and in Toronto. Yeah, so this would be a study that you could participate in. And then is a study that has just started so it says basically not yet recruiting, which means that these centers are still working on setting up the trial and doing ethics approval and contracting. Yeah, but this again is a study that looks at an oral compound from Bristol Myers Squibb, looking at 360 participants. Typically, this would be done in about 100 sites worldwide. And you see here a few in Canada. That would be in Vancouver, in Toronto, Montreal, and Sherbrooke. Yeah, so this would be a study that is available. And if you look at this number, you could find the contact information and you would know exactly which site that is. Right now, it just says one site 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you look at them, and you will find exactly which person that would be.
Dr. Kolb, several people want to know, do you have to live in the city where they're doing this clinical trials, or can you live somewhere else and still participate?
That's, in theory, you can live somewhere else, but of course, these trials typically need the patient to come in quite regularly to a visit. So because we need to make sure that we monitor for safety. So the first 3 months, you probably have to come like 3-4 times. Yeah, at the beginning, after 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, after 8 weeks, and then every 3 months for a year's time. So often when you live too far away, it's probably not feasible. So let's say if you are in North Bay and you want to do a study in Toronto, it's probably doable. Yeah. So if you're used to like using the travel grants for getting medical care already, so often trials would be able to even reimburse for that travel. Yeah. But if it's too far away, it's probably too cumbersome.
Okay, Dr. Kolb, someone is also asking, they've been part of a clinical trial before, but why was it that the drug would come out first in either Europe or in the US, but not in Canada?
Very simple, that the bigger markets for a drug company, or the biggest market is the US usually, where they make the most revenue. And Europe is obviously much bigger than Canada, and they have a pan-European drug approval, so which covers, of course, a big population. So knowing how much paperwork is required for a regulatory agency to approve a drug and test and look at all this evidence, and they look at it into the nitty-gritty details, way beyond what is published in the scientific literature. Of course, the companies focus first on those bigger regulatory areas, and then they would go to the smaller ones. Canada is typically relatively quick in getting attention because we have a robust healthcare system, and Canada. So Health Canada is often not that far behind. In fact, Epiphenidone was approved in Canada way ahead of the United States, and almost in sync with the European Medicines Agency. Yeah, but mostly that's the reason why drugs are typically available earlier in the US than in Canada. Yeah, but at the beginning of using Esbriet for patients with lung fibrosis, we had the interesting happening that a lot of patients from the US traveled north of the border to get drugs that they couldn't get in the United States. So sometimes happens the other way around too. But that's pretty much the reason for it.
Dr. Kolb, someone also wanted to know, why would they come out with a generic fibrotic? Why doesn't the original company that created the drug, why don't they just lower the price after they've recuperated their research costs?
So how do I answer that in a diplomatic way now? You would think that's common sense, and companies would usually do that. Yeah, because as I said, the price of most of these drugs, not all, but most of the drugs, is not because of what a single pill costs and the cost of making it and distributing it. The price is really because you have to do all these trials. Patent protection is there to give someone, a company that does all this research work, a couple of years protected time to sell their drugs in a monopoly situation, just to make back some of the investment. That's absolutely fair. That's like with anything where you have a patent on. Now, Canada is, in my view, to some degree, unfortunately, favoring generics in all areas of medicine because of the cost. And I think in Quebec, if I'm not mistaken, for instance, once a generic is out on the market, the brand and manufacturer is out. They just don't, they can't even, they're not allowed to lower the price because the system wants generics to be in the market because they are cheaper. From a government perspective, of course, I'd see the rationale because it's less costly. But you were wondering why Health Canada is later than the FDA. Of course, companies know that the environment is not necessarily in favor of these novel brand name drugs. And so it's for a company's perspective, not the most fertile ground to get some of the revenue that they invested in. So I think it's a very complex question. Yeah. So in regards to Esbriet, obviously the company was willing to reduce the price, but something in the interaction between government and the company did not allow them to do it. Yeah, but they would have been very willing, and we talked to them to come down and match the price, but something did not allow that to happen. So I hope that was diplomatic enough, but.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kolb.
Okay, so I'm pretty much at the end here. So there is another one, and yes, people who were on Esbriet know that Roche makes Esbriet, and they are still committed to this field. They have a lot of brilliant, good scientists, and they are a very committed group of people in the inspiration program. And of course, they were all taken by surprise that they couldn't do what I just said. But they bought the rights to this new medication, which is an infusion, and this is currently tested in patients with IPF. Yeah, so that's one of the trials where I said the smaller trial was promising. So they do a big one now. It's almost 660 patients that they aim to recruit. Takes a little longer to set this trial up because you need to have ability to make an infusion, which adds some complexity to a clinical trial. But there are a number of sites in Canada that are going to recruit patients, be in Hamilton as well, but in other sites in the Maritimes, in British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec as well. So I think this is probably the biggest trial that will allow patients to get enrolled in a large number of cities in Canada.
Dr. Kolb,
Yep.
Someone wanted to know if they are part of a clinical trial and they're on the drug and not the placebo. When the trial is completed, are they able to stay on that drug?
So that depends on the trial. So we have, most trials would offer that option. So because it's called an open label extension study. So and if I'm working with a company and they ask me about, does it make sense to add this period after the 52 weeks? I mostly say this makes a lot of sense. Yeah? For one, you do collect more safety information. you will have a chance to see how does a patient do that was on placebo for a year and now is on the drug. So if their slope of lung function changes after being on the real drug, that's an important signal for efficacy. It basically tells you, yes, this really works. And of course, patients are much more inclined to join such a trial because they know even if they got placebo for a year, after 1 year, they get the real drug. And if that real drug is approved eventually, in all cases that I have seen so far, the patients who were in the trials were on this drug until the government reimburses it. So I think that most of these trials are offering this extension. Of course, if it does not work, if a trial is negative, then it would stop at some point. Yeah, but then of course you don't want to take something that doesn't work.
Yeah. Dr. Kolb, someone wanted to know if you can maybe share a little bit more on the Roche clinical trial, the STARScape.
Yeah, so this is as I said, it's a big trial. This compound is called pentraxin. It's actually in other words, it's called serum amyloid P. That's a molecule that our liver makes. So it's in a way an endogenous. So it's a if you want, it's a natural medicine because the body makes this stuff. And we know that patients with fibrosis, not only IPF, but other types of fibrosis, may not have enough of this stuff. Yeah, so the assumption is that this molecule is one of these checkpoints that tell scar-forming cells, fibroblasts, that they should stop. And if you don't have this checkpoint and you get disease because they don't stop, then you just give more of this checkpoint and then it stops. That's the thinking. I mean, it's a bit simplified, but that's roughly what it is. Yeah. So in a way, if you want, this is maybe not true natural medicine, but in a way, it's sort of more natural than the others. And as I said, the tricky element to this trial is that you need an infusion every 3 weeks, I believe. So the question before about can you go to these trials if you live more remote, that might make it very difficult when you have to travel too far for an infusion every 3 weeks. But there are a number of these sites that are currently active. If it says not yet recruiting, that really just means they are still in the process of setting it up with paperwork and setting up the pharmacy. So you can imagine that this is quite complex. Yeah, because for an infusion, you need to make sure that this blinding is guaranteed, right? So you need to prepare often in the local pharmacy the infusion. So that person obviously is not truly blinded because they know what they mix in. And then he has to be packaged in tinfoil or whatever that no one sees what it is in there. And even the tubing that in an infusion typically is transparent. So you need to have the same kind of colored liquid that goes through this tubing when you get placebo versus the real trial. So it just, when it says not yet recruiting, it just means that these sites are still sort of in the process of being set up, but usually they all have a list of patients who are interested and they would contact them. That's what we do. If you have interest in getting enrolled in any of these trials, you can also get to me through Sharon and I can try and help you.
Thank you, Dr. Kolb.
Yeah, so I think I'm pretty much at the end. So this is that's the 5th of the trials that will be recruiting patients in Canada. Yeah, so there's only one site so far. Because this is brand new. I think that's the first patient in this trial will be randomized this week in the United States. So this is something very new. It's an oral compound as well, and I'm actually coordinating this trial on a global level. Yeah, so there will be a few more sites coming to Canada, hopefully. Yeah, but so really, those are the things that I wanted to share with you today about drug therapy, about the existing drugs and how to use them, how to manage them. I hope I was able to explain a little bit why these drugs are so costly. Yeah, so that this is not a rip-off that the pharmaceutical companies want to make. It's really, this is just how much it costs to test these compounds, and if you don't offer an incentive to a drug developer, of course they would not invest resources in creating new medicines, which we need so dearly, right?
So, Dr. Pope, someone wanted to know, because they have PF related to rheumatoid arthritis, they're taking a drug called Rituxan, and they're wondering, should they go on Pirfenidone or Nintedanib as you had presented?
So, yeah, so rheumatoid arthritis is in our grouping a disease. It's called an autoimmune disease. So there is a bit of an autoimmunity problem that starts a rheumatoid arthritis. So if you have that, you know how kind of your joints just flare up, are angry, painful, swollen, right? So there's a lot of inflammation and bad action going on. And if you treat this with anti-inflammation drugs, such as prednisone or rituximab, that could subside. But if you have long involvement with this, at some point, this inflammation is getting less important and scarring or fibrosis is getting more important. Now, this is not a sudden switch that next week you start to be fibrotic and last week you were inflammatory. It's a very gradual process. So in lots of situations, rituximab might be a very good choice because inflammation is a major element of why someone feels bad. At some point, anti-fibrosis medication might be a better choice. In a lot of patients, it would actually be an overlap. Yeah, so we would expect that a lot of these patients would have a time when they get both anti-inflammatories such as rituximab and anti-inflammatories, and only nintedanib is approved for it. Yeah, but you know, that brings us back to the government because both are expensive, so they may force us to pick one over the other, right? So which is doesn't make sense from a doctor's perspective or a biology perspective, but from a payer and government perspective, of course, it makes a bit more sense.
Oh, Dr. Cope, someone wanted to know, like, if they were interested in being part of the clinical studies, is it up to the respirologist to make that recommendation? How do they look them up, and how do they say, I would like to be part of that or be considered?
No, you can. I mean, you know, we would welcome anyone in who is a reasonably travel distance to us to come and approach us, and so would any other site. Yeah, so we have, I mean, a lot of the people who are on the CPFF Medical Advisory Board are typically involved in clinical trials at a larger scale. So Dr. Ryerson, Dr. Fell, Johansson, Shapira, myself, and Dr. Asayak and Mangana and Morissette in Quebec, or Dr. Contan, Sherbrooke. So, I mean, they are all on our advisory board. And if you are sort of in proximity to them, you could ask them and they would be able to direct you. I mean, those are the trials that are recruiting in Canada. And you don't need a referral for a trial. Yeah, so if someone has an interest in doing a clinical trial comes to me, I would usually say, you know, I really need to make sure first that you have exactly the disease that is qualifying for that trial. So I would typically ask for a clinical assessment first. For that, I need a referral, but there would be no respirologist who would be objecting to someone who wants to be in a clinical trial. So, you know, we had quite a few, you know, Barbara Barr, who you will well know, right, from the foundation. She worked for years with Endless Power for the foundation. She was living in the Toronto area, but we did a clinical trial that was not done in Toronto. So she traveled from Toronto to Hamilton all the time to get into this clinical trial. Yeah, so this is something where you find that the Canadian fibrosis doctors are very well connected and collaborative.
Dr. Kolb, someone want to know, what is Sjogren's disease? Can this be because of IPF?
You mean Sjogren's disease?
Sjogren's, yes, sorry.
So Sjogren's disease is also one of these disorders that we put into this autoimmune box. So it's in a large sense a rheumatological disease. It affects the joints less frequently. It's often causing kind of drying out of the salivary glands and the tears. So patients with Sjogren's often have kind of very dry eyes, painful, they have dry mouth, and they can get fibrosis in the lungs. So, and that fibrosis can sometimes look like IPF, sometimes it looks very differently. And someone who has Sjogren's disease has also a bit of higher risk to get lymphomas. So it's not IPF, but it can develop into a degree where it behaves like IPF in regard to the lungs. And we would then also be able to treat it with anti-fibrosis medication, but often it would be treated with other drugs before, like anti-inflammatories. It typically would be mycophenolate or cyclophosphamide.
Okay. Dr. Kolb, someone wanted to know, do these drugs affect males and females differently?
The drugs, not really. So the diseases are sometimes more often found in men or women. Yeah? So IPF affects men more than women. Scleroderma affects women more than men. But the drugs would be very similar no matter what gender.
Okay. All right. And all these clinical trials, they're looking for both men and women, correct?
Yes, yes. So yeah, they're all men and women.
Is there an age limit?
Well, often, like when you get, often they'll stop at age 80. Some of them are older. Yeah, so it's it's just that these trials want to avoid that a patient is enrolled with a lot of comorbidities. Yeah, so if you have other diseases that affect older folks, that could be someone who does not tolerate a drug that well, or who has other problems that could interfere with the trial. But the typical age bracket would be between 18 and 80, sometimes older. But if these trial numbers that I put on here, they all say exactly what age group is targeted. Yeah, but what is a practical question is some of these trials allow what we call standard of care. So they would test new drugs on top of what you're already on. So on top of OFEV or Espred. Some others would test them only in people who are not on any other anti-fibrosis drug. So it's mostly like this one here, for instance, or ISON. That would be mostly a trial that is for patients who tried the other drugs and didn't tolerate them, or that who have heard bad things about nintedanib and Epiphenidone and don't want to try them.
Okay.
Yeah, with that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. So I guess someone wanted to know, do you think the Starscape drug trial could possibly make OFEV less effective?
It's one of the things that will be a part of the study purpose, right? So it's not very likely, yeah, because that's part of what the tests would do prior to a trial being that big. Yeah, that they already try to address those questions. Yeah, and there's of course a scenario where you say, well, a new drug, so an investigational drug, does not go well with an existing drug. Yeah, and then you would say, well, it does not make sense to test this new drug then with the existing drug together. Yeah, because you may lose to find the signal. Yeah, so it's if you have a drug A which is new and you combine it with the drug B, which is old, and the drug B has a 50% effect, and you take that away with drug A, so your drug A will look like doing nothing, right? So it would not be in your interest to do that. Yeah, so they would have done that, yeah, but they would always be conscious about safety, and they would constantly check for safety and drug-drug interference alongside the other trial outcomes.
Thank you. I was going to ask my audience one more time. We're coming to the end of the hour. If anybody have any other questions, please post them in. Otherwise, I'm going to thank Dr. Kolb for his wonderful presentation and all the new clinical trials that are coming up, because it gives us a lot of hope and something to look forward to. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think it's there's a lot of activity, and I mean, as I heard before, one of the audience said that it's not only IPF. That's correct. Yeah, so some of these trials are either already looking for other types of pulmonary fibrosis, or they will be looking for other types of pulmonary fibrosis. Yeah, so this one, for instance, they do a trial as well for scleroderma associated pulmonary fibrosis, and some of these companies will look for diseases that have pulmonary fibrosis but not IPF. Yeah, so it's it's just a matter of time. I know I said that before, and yes, if you're a patient looking at a bad prognosis and a patient who is in trouble, for you it can never be fast enough, which is of course very unfortunate, but you can be assured that people try their best to do this as quickly as possible, but in the sake of safety, it always takes time, right? So you can't really sacrifice safety for the sake of speed.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kolb. Really appreciate today. And everybody on the panel today that have attended, they've all said that they really appreciate everything you shared. They have learned so much, and they feel very hopeful.
That's good. So there's always hope, and we keep fighting, right?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Martin. Take care.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks all. Bye-bye.